our spokespersons. For the next session, I want to make a quick introduction before the facilitator takes over. Nepuni Piku is a long-time human rights activist, having been involved in activism since his student days. He was NPMHR Convener Delhi, NPMHR Secretary General, and also Secretary General of the International Alliance on Rainforests based in London. Today he is a member of the Forum for Naga Reconciliation and RRAD, and he is also chairperson of the Morung Foundation for Just Peace. But he calls himself a gardener. I give the rest of the time to him.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for the wonderful introduction. Good morning to all those who have gathered here to participate, engage, and learn from this September dialogue. This morning, we are privileged to have some distinguished Naga scholars on the panel to share the knowledge, their insights, and the imagination on the theme colonization, repatriation, and decolonization, exploration of a Naga perspective. May I take this opportunity to introduce the two main speakers on the panel in the session 1 of this September dialogue series. First of all, may I call upon Professor Dr. Dolly Kikon. Can we have you on the dais? Dr. Dolly Kikon is a name which is not new to many of us, especially here in the state of Nagaland. I personally knew her as a junior during our university days in Delhi. She has been a very committed and focused student activist then. But today, she is a professor in the University of California, Santa Cruz, in the Department of Archaeology. She also serves as the director of Center for South Asian Study. Besides that, she has served earlier in the University of Melbourne in the Department of Anthropology, and she has been, to a large extent, responsible in facilitating a Naga delegation travel and engagement in the University of Melbourne in Australia some years back. Thank you, Dr. Dolly. Welcome. The next we have Professor Dr. Tiatoshi Jamir. Can I request our professor to join us here on stage? Dr. Tiatoshi Jamir is a professor of archaeology in the Department of History and Archaeology, Nagaland University, Kohima campus. His main interests include mortuary, archaeology, prehistory of early agriculture in Northeast India, cave archaeology, and community archaeology. With that, I will just briefly share a gist on the theme that we will go through the panels of speakers that we have here on the dais. Throughout our history, we have seen that history is mostly narrated through the lens of the dominant or the more powerful, while the excluded and suppressed sustain on the collective memories of the many intergenerational traumas in order to retell their stories through crafting alternative narratives to make themselves whole again. Due to its involvement in reconciliation work, the Forum for Naga Reconciliation responded to the need to facilitate a dialogue examining issues together around the repatriation of ancestral human remains, its processes, and its intersection with reconciliation and social healing. This process with the Naga people is to help better understand together the crucial process of repatriation in order for the people to give an informed consent on the possible return of the Naga ancestral human remains to their homeland. In many of the public engagement so far, I have come across questions being raised on various issues such as colonization and its impact, indigeneity, decolonization, repatriation, and so on, which are a totally new vocabulary in our ongoing discourse here in Naga homeland, often unable to situate ourselves contextually many a time. Though our experiences of colonialism may be vast, we are still limited in our internally generated resources, such as academic output, through our own independent perspective or knowledge bank. There is no ready-made framework on the various topics, whether it is decoloniality, colonization, indigeneity, repatriation, or decolonization. Let us all explore with open mind and in an accommodative manner, allowing space even to the point of agreeing to disagree in our search for an alternative indigenous Naga perspective or narrative. In this journey to create a transformative Naga narrative, we will require a clear space for the greater public engagement and of nurturing academic independence, which addresses the crucial questions of dehumanization and resistance to progressive change in a post-decolonized discourse in the creation of new knowledge bank. With that, I conclude. Before we go into the speakers taking time, we have once again Dr. Yuimi Vashum. Is she already in the? Okay, thank you. We will have now, before we give time to the speakers, we will have a poem recital from Yuimi Vashum. Yuimi Vashum, can you please come forward? Take your time. Yuimi Vashum is an educationist based in Ukhrul, Manipur. She is currently engaged in a lecture at Sentinel College, Ukhrul, Department of English. She is also a published author with keen interest in preserving the stories of our people. Our books are also displayed at the back, so you are kindly requested to check on it later. May I call?
Very good evening. Before I go on with my poem, I would like to give a brief background. The poem is titled "But Sari Would Not Agree." So Sari is the term for grandmother in my dialect. I had the opportunity to live with my grandmother and live the experiences of those who have lived a century back. She is 105 and still strong, so I used to listen to a lot of her stories and all the regrets and all the good things that she has lived through her life. And now that she is old and that her memories are fading, all she can recall is the past of her good days with her parents. So this poem was inspired by my grandmother. She recalls her father very fondly, her father who was one of the member who was sent to France, who was one of the who was among the labor corps for France, sent to France. So it greatly impacted her father, and in turn it impacted my grandmother as well. So this is a poem dedicated to my grandmother. Many her fathers sang to her of his passage to France, bundled up along with others to fight a war that was never his. Sari would not grieve the graves she dug. I wonder if the grief faded with her aged memories. Yet she would look at the vast ocean played out on the screen, only to talk to herself about the burial at sea that made her father cry. Sari cannot recollect the names, but the pain she does. She would cry before the TV why they, the white people, had to throw us into the sea. In anguish she grumbles, oh, to be plucked from the hills only to rot in the sea. She asks me if the bodies at sea could still be reached, and cries for the mothers, wives, daughters, who would never hear from the father. How do I reason with her when the war was never ours to begin with? To justify, I draw up words for Sari that perhaps their souls had found their way home. But she would not listen. Why did they go? Why were they taken? She mutters. For after a century of living, Sari has gone back to being the little girl who waited years for her father's return. After a brief silence, she asked me to take her back to our village in the spring. She wants to sing with her friends. Yet I do not have the heart to tell her that she is the last of her kind, the kind who encountered foreign faces in our midst, the kind who remembered how it was to live untouched by the West, the kind who had to trade their brews for a Bible, the kind who lived in stories and songs. Her memory resembles a short reel, brief enough to give us a lesson, only to abruptly wind in another. Sari would bring back the questions to me, I know. And as I scramble for answers, I pause and wonder if my forefathers resisted or listened and agreed to the calls of the strange white man when all their lives they had lived, listening to the sky, the rivers, and the land. But I know for sure Sari would not agree. Thank you.
Thank you, Yumi. Just to set the ball rolling, I will be giving 20 minutes each to the speakers. and I think we'll have roughly around 40 minutes to engage after the presentations. So I want to request all the participants to be free and to raise any queries that you want clarification in the process. May I request the first speaker, Dr. Dolly, Professor Dr. Dolly, to take her time.
Hello all, and a very good morning. Am I clear? Yeah, I see students and I see lots of, I think, well-wishers, friends, elders. So just want to make sure that this is going to be an interactive session. Some of you are wearing uniforms, and it reminds me of my school. I live in the neighborhood. This area is where I was born. I grew up here. And every big tree that you see, if it's a imli tree or a mango tree, just know that I have climbed those trees. And I have stolen some mangoes in my childhood. So you are actually here in my playground, and a very, very, I think, deep place where I am always very fond of returning. Thank you, Nepuni, for a generous introduction. He was my senior, and we have, I think, worked together for decades, I would say. The first time I met Nepuni was around 1995, 94, 95. Some of you were not even born. And so you can see a history right here in terms of life and in terms of how fast life goes. So I'm very, very honored to be here today. And I am very privileged, I should say, to spend this time and share this platform with my colleague, Professor Tiatoshi. One of the first decolonizing essay that I read from Naga scholars was actually the Decolonizing Archaeology that he wrote, which I also quoted in one of the public lectures that I shared. It was in Kohima. One of the first Naga scholars who reached out when the repatriation conversation was going on was actually Professor Tiatoshi. His generosity and the kind of reflections and the maturity and the support that he brought on was, I would say, very, very amazing and very, I think, touching for me. It was a new phase that I was entering into. And as a fellow scholar, he came on board and he suggested a few tips, and he always said that he would think of us in this journey. Today I stand here on behalf of my teams to set the stage, they say, for the two-day dialogue. And I am actually, how can I say, at loss to how to share the last 4 years. What I'm going to do is focus on 3 terms right here: the repatriation, decolonizing, and healing terms that the Recover, Restore, and Decolonize team and the Forum for Naga Reconciliation has time and again used. Why this process is important. I think for some of you who came early this morning, you might have seen me just trying to hide in the shadows. I was sitting in that corner trying to look at my phone, and I felt like it was an exam all over again. And trust me, from class 8 till class 10, I studied here in Dimapur, and I felt like it was an exam. Because it's not only for me a homecoming every summer, but to interact with you all, my students here, my colleagues, elders, and well-wishers. This is really a time where I have to ask myself to come up to the mark, maybe to say the perfect things, maybe to say the most wise things, maybe to say the most intellectually stimulating things. And I know at the end of my 20 minutes, I'm going to fail radically. I'm going to fail hopelessly, because you might have more questions than the ones that I have shared. What I was doing sitting here on that corner in the dark was actually trying to figure out how many items were there from an essay that Arkotong and I had written in 2021. And I'll tell you why sometimes my memory fails. I think we're at that stage in our lives where we are not only professors, We are not only committed to the services that we own to our respective academy and institutions, but we are also caregivers, right? We are also caregivers of our parents who are still alive, of the larger family, of our elders who are passing on. And how do we make sense of this time? I belong to a Naga generation where you can say I'm entering my middle ages, and soon I will be in my 50s. Maybe some of you see me as an elder, some of you see me as a teacher. For my elders here, some of you see me as your junior. And for my seniors like Nepuni, they see me as a little sister, still walking the walk together. So what I was doing this morning was desperately trying to figure out the number that I needed to remember. 6,466 approximate items at the Pittsburgh Museum. The Pittsburgh Museum holds the largest Naga collection. And how many human remains? I had to refresh my memory because the whole summer I've been a caregiver for my elders in the family who are aging. Approximately 213 human remains. What does this say about human memory and how much we fail every day and how much we hold ourselves accountable and one another accountable at the table, at the podium to judge? Will Professor Tiatoshi say the right thing? Will Dolly say the right thing? What can we talk after the event? What greater debates should emerge? And that should be the spirit, definitely. But we have to understand where those questions come from. I prayed and I introspected about what I should say this morning. In 20 minutes, how do I wrap up 4 years of an amazing life-transforming journey? For repatriation, decolonization, and healing, I thought that I will give an equivalent of a term that maybe Gen Z and the young ones and also the elders are able to relate to. My dear students, colleagues, and elders, I thought that the best way to figure out repatriation, decolonization, or healing, and how to heal are all processes that acknowledge indigenous perspective and research centered on community care. And today, I'm going to use repatriation, decolonizing, and healing to set the stage for us to think together, not to agree in everything, but in a sense to think together about what it means in the Naga context. I have been around the world and I've taught in around 4 continents, and every time I have been at loss for how do I make sense of the world. Different, Europe speaks many other languages. I have been in Australia, I studied in Hong Kong, I did my postdoc in Sweden, now I'm a professor in California. How do I make sense of this world? I always come back to a context. And I think this context I'm talking about is right here, Duncan Basti, or right here, even Edisicor Junction. And I'm speaking the truth. For repatriation, I really thought hard, how do we make sense of it? And the term trigger came to my mind, right? Trigger warning. What things trigger us? Repatriation has been a trigger for the Naga people in the last 4 years. Right? You hear repatriation, you want to react. Itu kia said. Let me dwell a little bit on that. I'll come back to that. Decolonization, what does it mean? For me, I can only speak about the journey that I'm having. For me, I see decolonization as a process, as a road. From Duncan Basti to Newmarket, how do I go to Baisukanmas? The process, the path, that has been decolonization for me. Healing. What is healing? Why does FNR talk about healing? So many hospitals in Nagaland, in Dimapur. To heal, where do you go? Sometimes you don't trust the doctors, you go to Guwahati. You catch the bus, you catch the plane, you catch the train. Healing. The word healing actually, what? Is connected to injury, to a wound. That's why you seek healing. So in a sense, when we talk about repatriation, decolonization, and healing, I have a word to go along with that. For repatriation, for me, in my experience as part of RAD and the FNR journey, it's a trigger warning, a trigger, emotional trigger. Decolonization as a process, as a path, and healing as a journey. Journey to where? Let's explore in the next 2 days, what does it mean? When we started talking about repatriation, some Nagas say that, oh, it's so new to the Naga people, we don't even know. And yet the more we dug, the more we figured out that the Naga people have been helping the Japanese war cemetery repatriate the remains of their soldiers. So much so, the Naga people have played such an important role that today they have a memorial park as well, inaugurated by the Chief Minister of Nagaland. So we cannot say that as Naga people in the 20th and the 21st century, the process of repatriation is something so new, while we see the front pages of the newspapers and the Chief Minister of Nagaland and the ambassador from Japan inaugurating parks, talking about healing and talking about a particular kind of history. But the Naga repatriation is something else. I think we need to actually contextualize. If the Japanese are talking about wars and human remains of soldiers lost in the Naga hills, for the Nagas here, the conversation that we are going to have is connected to a museum. Museum where in the United Kingdom. What are museums? Museums are something very old in human history. It goes back to the Greek times, right? In a sense, what does a museum do? Perhaps a word from Latin where it's a library, it displays arts and other kinds of collections. So in a sense, we are actually, you and I are dealing with repatriation of Naga ancestral human remains from a museum somewhere very far away. But why does it trigger us so much? And what is this trigger? The example that came to my mind is the landslide that took place, the tragic landslide which took 6 lives and kind of like really destroyed a road. I think in the last 72 hours, if you look at social media, especially Naga social media, the anger. Is it the road? Why? Why is this happening to us? So many people are angry. All of a sudden, the road is gone. Corruption, inequality, the Naga culture of not caring. What's happening? Perhaps not a very good example, but I found that when 4 years ago the word repatriation came into the Naga world and we were talking about it, it was such a trigger for so many people, and especially among the intellectual crowds. Why? What is this? How are we going to do this? When are the remains coming? Why is it important? Emotions of surprise, of sadness, of shame. Why should we go to that, to the past? Anger. Anger, even to the extent of, who are you? Who are you all to even talk about repatriation? The next thing that triggered us was, how should we care? Why should we care? When there is so much inequality here, why should we care about this? Perhaps I don't have the answer, but I'm going to lay these questions in front of you. Why is repatriation such a trigger for us today? With the education we have. Why is it? Do we want the remains back? Do we not want the remains back? I think that's why the dialogue is important. The second thing about the process today and tomorrow is the word decolonization. So many students ask me, Professor Kikon, what is decolonization? The process, if you look at Google, artificial intelligence, the process of becoming independent from a colonial rule to achieve independence from colonial rule, that's all true, but I would actually go somewhere else with the term decolonization. To decolonize is to recognize our indigenous history. To decolonize is to not be ashamed. In my case of coming from Dimapur, Nagaland, being a Naga, teaching in California, being able to stand in a podium like this in New York, anywhere else in the world, and saying, listen, I have important things to say because I belong to a world where their experiences matter as a global experience, centering our history and how do we think about the future together. Often I can go on about the indigenous students' experiences around, always being shut down, always telling that, but you know, you don't have the whole picture. Who has the whole picture of the Naga people, if not the future students and scholars and community members sitting in this room and across the Naga homeland? I am an anthropologist and I'm a researcher, and for more than 2 decades I've done research. And I look at decolonization as a term that came from the academy, that came from the world of research, that came from our seniors like Linda Smith and others who focus on writing books like Decolonizing Methodology. So in a say, if we focus on decolonization, for me, I see it as a process, and what kind of process? A map. And in my own way, I see it as a moment where I can take an example when a researcher comes to me. Many of you do research as undergrads, as master's students, as PhDs, and there is always a confusion when students start to do research. They place the research questions. If you're in research, you will know what I'm saying. They write the research questions, and then they have to write the methodology part. So if the research question is about how do I get from Duncan Basti to Newmarket? Well, I can get auto rickshaw, I can walk, I can hitchhike with my uncle maybe in the neighborhood. But the methodology would be absolutely alien because Bhabanaitu. So the methodology is not about getting out at the ADC Court Junction and how to go to Newmarket. It will be about Acha, how do I go to Dilaiget and then go to Dipu. And then we stop at Manja to drink some tea. As a professor, indigenous scholar, what I have seen is that the research questions that you have and the methodology nimile. That's why instead of going to buy Sukhan Mas or to buy Sabji from Duncan Basti to Newmarket, because the methodology is something else, we are going off to Manja and to Dipu. What does it mean then? Decolonization in the world of research, because it is used so freely in the academy, is overused, like a napkin paper, like a tissue paper in a toilet. But I say that decolonization is a way of life. It is a practice, right? It is kind of about rendering a service to community and to care. It is a methodology of life. It is a challenge to researchers. In a sense, when they seek answers, how do they get from point A to point B? So for me, when I think about decolonization, it is a path. Students, stay with me. I don't want you to be lost here. From Duncan Basti to Newmarket. And you might be saying, I thought Professor Kikon was going to come and give us a list of, books to understand decolonization. If it is a practice, you have to embody it. You see what I'm saying? It is like saying, if you have to understand decolonization intellectually, it is like using your eyes and looking at the gym or looking at the playground, and say, I will become a marathon runner. I will do planks. I will do push-ups for 100 push-ups, and not being able to use your legs to get there. Bujishina? It is like saying, I'm going to catch the train and go to Delhi, but sitting in your home and not using your legs to go there. Your eyes, the intellectual decolonization, and then the practice, the embodied practice of care, absolutely detached. So in the next 2 days, we're going to try to understand what does it mean to embody decolonization. The third and the last point that I want to share is actually, like I said, related to caring for hurt and injury. When you talk about healing, what do you feel? When you talk about healing, it can be physical, cut, it can be emotional, a wound, a trauma. It is, in other words, a work, ongoing work of reintegration, the emotional, the spiritual, and the physical. So when you cut a wound and there's a surgery, what happens? Physiotherapy. Sometimes to understand the most complicated journeys, human journeys, collective journeys, we are required to go back to the basics. You can only be a runner and an Olympic champion when you know how to walk, when you know the pacing, when you know how to work with speed. So in a sense, I really feel that the process of healing is so important that the three come together. I'm not a counselor. I'm not a psychosocial healer in a sense. I'm a researcher, a teacher. And I've always thought about caring for one another. And why is it that as a teacher, as a human rights activist, as a scholar who seeks to find answer to justice, why is it that the Naga hurt, the collective hurt, runs so deep? And why is it that the Naga collective anger and hatred and the rage is even deeper? And what does it tell us about embracing the process and the journey of healing? I will stop here by saying that healing is a journey. And what is the destination? You might ask me in return. Professor Kikon, what is the destination? I think the destination, in a sense, is for us then to reflect on wholeness, on reconciliation, and perhaps at the end, the journey of healing is to find a way to transcend suffering. And maybe those questions rest in our mortality and how we care for one another and how we see this life as a limited gift on earth. And with those words, I will stop here. Thank you so much for sharing this time with me.
Thank you, Dr. Dolly, for the wonderful sharing. Now we'll be privileged to hear from Professor Dr. Tiatoshi. So I request Professor to kindly come and take your time.
It's a great privilege to be here. And before I actually start off with, I would like to thank the FNR and the RAD community for inviting me to speak on this very historic moment. And also at the same time, my thanks to Nepuni and Professor Dolly for those kind words. Since we have just 20 minutes at our disposal, we would leave the niceties during the tea break, and we'll just dive into what I feel is really important to be shared, at least from my perspective. Can I have the slide rolling? Okay, so this talk which I will be giving is Iseng Utse. Iseng is ours or us. This is in Changi, since I come from that village. Iseng Utse is story. Naga repatriation as a decolonization process. And through this process of Naga repatriation, I've been, reading very closely to Dolly's lectures, archothons, and also the RAD team, and also people who have raised their concerns even prior to that. So I want to start off with this decolonizing from the discipline of archaeology first, because this is where I first has been exposed to this idea of decolonizing. And this draws experiences from this community archaeology that we have been engaged for the last, I think more than a decade that we have been engaged in such community archaeological practice. And you would see the contrast of our work as opposed to the black and white image that you see to your extreme right, is a black and white image of Sir Mortimer Wheeler. And Sir Mortimer Wheeler was the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India. And it's very sad to say that this kind of colonial practice of archaeology still persists in a country where we have issues on decolonization, and you'll see also a lot of other institutions, even today, as we speak, there must be a lot of archaeological digs happening across this country, and you will see how people engage local communities in the study of their past heritage. And I think from our disciplinary perspective, the way we do archaeology in Northeast India is quite different from the way it is being taught and also implemented and initiated in the conventional way, right? So my personal journey with decolonization is with regards to field archaeology within a participatory praxis in a South Asian context. And I view the role of indigenous community engagement in archaeological research as a starting point for decolonizing archaeological practice in Northeast India, particularly Nagaland. And these are images that you see on our community archaeology work at Changsang Mongpo, which is a Chang ancestral site, which was undertaken in the year 2019. And just the image to your extreme right, the black and white image, and what you see of our image and our work, the ongoing work, it does speak a lot about decolonizing archaeology and the way we do archaeology in contrast to what others are engaged in mainland India. This is another very old community archaeology project that we have initiated, which is at the site of Chunglimti, one of our ancestral site, our ancestral site. And this was a work which was initiated in 2007 and 2008. And this is just to give you a perspective of how we engage local communities, the descent communities, in the way that we do archaeology and practice archaeology, and see how the indigenous history of the region, particularly descent communities. Here we are dealing with communities that are very, very specific. They are local communities, but at the same time, they are descent communities. Descent communities that have historical link to their ancestral sites. So here I want to draw your attention to this idea of decolonization. And this stems on some recent work and also this idea of interculturality. And I'm glad that in the circular which was circulated by the RAD team, I saw this word intercultural, which I think in most community engagement research nowadays use this idea of intercultural. And we have been implementing this intercultural dialogue with communities that we work for ages. So it's been very, very long that we have been employing these ideas. And this is important because this is not just getting to know each other and just chit chat, but this is a more deeply engaged, long-standing personal relationships that you build up with communities that you study, right? So it's not like a kind of a band-aid solution that you just offer. That is one. And the other concern is, besides the disciplinary decolonizing methods, there's also this idea of decolonizing ourselves, right? Revisiting our cultural practices, cultural forms, and knowledge imposed upon us by the West. And so also the other decolonizing process is a strive to decolonize the state and the relationship between the state and indigenous communities. So, these are some of the areas that I feel this Naga repatriation process should also be drawing some of these ideas as well. And I'm glad that this intercultural notion is there in the red, idea of this Naga repatriation process. Okay, so I just want to build a context here, and for many of us, these images are not new, but for the students here, for the benefit of the students, I feel that it is important to see these images. This is an image on the Pangsha punitive expedition of 1936, and also at the same time you see some of the booties that were looted from the village. This is one, and also this is from the Hammendorf collection of 1937, as he was traveling out of Woking with all these artifacts and human remains that he was carrying along. And this was actually for somebody who was waiting on the other side of the state, somewhere between Kohima and Dimapur, by this Paul Wills. I'm not very sure whether any of you have heard of this name, Paul Wills. He happened to be the collector commissioned by the Basel Museum, Switzerland. And what you see at the foreground is his son, who later on became to be a very established artist. And most of these remains that were looted from the Naga hills were sent through such kind of convoys to Europe. Some landed in the Museum of Vienna, some in UK, and also elsewhere. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay. There's a colleague who has worked on the Naga collections for quite some time, and he has been into this research since, I think, since the mid-90s, and is Alok Kanungo. And this was the first time my experience with this kind of horrifying images that you see here, display which was put up in the Pitt Rivers Museum in 2003, which is no longer there. It has been taken down. And also this ethnology museum at Vienna. And Alok was raising ethical concerns related to how the skulls were put up in the museums and the artifacts that he thinks that should be returned back and so on. So these were some of the earlier concerns raised by him. And we also have some of his newspaper articles, which was published in Nagaland Post, the Morung Express, and also some of the book chapters. And very recently, because of all this Naga repatriation issues, we also have, again, a paper written by him very recently in 2024, Signifiers, Signified and Signed, a case study of Naga ancestral remains at Pitt Rivers Museum. Okay, so this is our clarion call on repatriation. This was as early as 2016, and the Northeast India Archaeology Forum. We have a small forum which comprises of just about 50 of us. And during one of the World Archaeological Congress, which was held at Kyoto in 2016, there was a session where where indigenous archaeologists were asked to raise some concerns about their heritage, their history. And so the session was taken over by this archaeologists Uzma Rizvi and Hirofomi Kato. And through their assistance, we have been able to raise this concern, and they've requested WAC to endorse a statement issued to the government of India to work collaboratively with indigenous archaeologists from Northeast India to repatriate both human remains and cultural objects to the regional museums in Northeast India. These materials are currently housed in museums elsewhere outside of India. There are also other concerns, but since the discussion rests on this particular idea, I'd just like to draw your attention to these earlier initiatives which were also initiated by the Archaeology of Northeast Forum. We have Kalilula's recent writings on No Rest for Our Ancestors in Museum, unpacking the preliminary impressions from the repatriation process of Naga ancestral remains, which more or less highlights the concern of RAT. And a very recent article by Viva Joshi on engaging with ethnographic museum objects from erstwhile Naga hills from imperial, colonial, and post-colonial eras in contemporary reimagining. You can read this article. It is available online, and this also raised concern about Naga repatriation. And so very recently, you'll see a lot of scholars are getting into this concern on Naga repatriation as well. Okay, so repatriation of Naga ancestral remains and artifacts and advocating a way forward. This is what I feel at a very personal level. So I think this systematic provenance work is really required. Systematic, I mean not only identifying from where they have come from, but I think it's also important to identify, perhaps with the help of experts, maybe bioarchaeologists who can really study the bones and be able to identify stress markers and be able to separate, classify the bone remains, whether they have been, as part of hunting, war trophies, or they might have, some of these remains might have come from human burials. And also the necessary support from governments and holding institutions like the PRM to provide resources required to enable Naga communities to undertake all aspects of repatriation processes, including the journey to their final resting place. So this is also part of the reparation and the restitution process as well. And also members from whose communities most of these remains originate should also be involved. And our study into the secondary burial practices of some of the Eastern Naga tribes and also Pochuris, it made us realize the complexity surrounding human remains, mortuary practices, circumstances of death, age, and gender. So we did a small study, not because of this Naga repatriation issues, but we also had issues regarding in one of our archaeological excavation where, which is quite an old site, dates back to around 2800 BCE. And we had human remains where they were all headless. And we wanted some ethnographic references for us to see whether this kind of practice may be related to some kind of a secondary burial practice. So these are images of our fieldwork at Krensang village, Nakshu, and this is in Mon, in Walking area, and Pongan. This is in Larata in Pochuri area, Mimi. And also the reason why I show this image is also to give you an impression on the changing attitudes towards death, right? So since it deals with human remains, these images also gives us some insights into the changing attitudes which are associated with death and also human remains. Another aspect which I feel is really interesting, and Dolly has already spoken about this, is healing. And this concern has been raised by also other anthropologists like Salome Dumomi and also some other anthropologists with whom I have encountered. And in the course of our discussion, they were saying that whether this healing actually applies to the Naga case, right? And what was interesting for me specifically was when we refer to the repatriation cases elsewhere, most of these human remains were from human burial. So it is reasonable on this idea of healing coming into play, right? But in our case, what is unique is that as we have seen from Lula's article, it seems like most of these remains seems to be from war trophies. They are heads and fragments of the skulls which were from war trophies. And also Alok Kanungo has also shared his concern that most of these remains are not from human burials. There could be some human remains coming from the human burials, but most of these remains happens to be coming from as a part of war trophies. So I think it is really important for us to really contextualize first before we also buttress upon this idea of healing, contextualize it and see whether this idea of healing can be incorporated into this Naga experiences or not. So this is just a food for thought that I've shared. And also at the same time, engage Naga scholars specialized in the study of human remains. There are few Naga scholars, bioarchaeologists, who have expertise in the study of human remains. I can recommend a few of their names, so they can also be a part of this repatriation, a part of this Naga repatriation process. So lastly, strengthening the exchange of scholars, students between collecting institutions and Nagas who will eventually contribute to the human resource development of the state is one area which we need to strengthen, and also digitize Naga materials, documents and artifacts locked away in British Museum archives and enable access to Naga scholars who are unable to travel to the UK and elsewhere. And finally, training of archivists and curators from the Department of Art and Culture, Government of Nagaland, and other institutions in Nagaland engage in museum studies as a part of a reparation process. So, sorry, I got carried away with the slides here. So just to run through this. This slide is, I intentionally show to give you an idea of the complexities of repatriation process that is involved. And I was a member of this UNESCO meeting which was held in New Delhi just recently, last month. And they had an exhibition on this repatriation of archaeological objects that were gathered from Australia and also elsewhere. And this gives you an idea of what could be the complexities and the bureaucratic hassles that we have to sort of break our way through to be able to achieve this Naga repatriation process. So thank you very much.